Hey everyone, my name is Kelvin. I'm a developer and I make free tutorial content. If you like this kind of thing, consider subscribing and liking the video. And if you want to support me in other ways, you're always welcome to buy me a coffee. Alright, before we move on to creating our entities, or the other schemas, I want to do a little bit of refactoring. And the first thing is more of a nitpick, but the responses are in a router package, and I want this to be a sub-package called response. So I'm going to move response and error into it, which means both of these we have to change the package to response. So now the response.go file and the error.go file are in the package of response. And because of the name change, we're going to need to change the import path as well as the package that we're calling it. So here would be response.defaultErrorHandler. There's one in routes.go, so here we also need to change this, as well as the return in our health check. And this also goes for all of our fiber handlers. So luckily we only have one controller, so it's not too many different places. But in auth controller, we'll change all of the router.created to response.created, or this will be response.ok. And this refactor is mainly just because I wanted to say response dot and then the status response. So it is a minor nitpick on the wording. But in addition, I want to have some more type safety. So inside of models, I'll make a new file called response. And here we're going to make some structs just to describe the structure of our API responses. And let's put this to the side. So we're essentially trying to mirror the JSON map that we created over here. So we have success, data, and meta. So this mirrors our API responses. This also means we can use these structs in response. So the return of generate metadata is no longer just an interface, it's an API metadata, which also means we need to update these keys. And then similarly with API response, I'll just put this over here so that we have more space. This is now going to be a model.API response, and also update these keys. And now we have proper models for type safety. And then finally, the last thing I want to do before we start this section is to have a bit of better error handling. And to explain what I actually want is that right now we're doing a log on the error inside of the default error handler, but I want to log out the raw error, which if we go to auth, we aren't really doing that. When we do if error is not nil, we just send a message. And this makes sense because we want to obfuscate it. We don't want to expose the error to the user. But in our own server, we want to actually read what went wrong. So to change a few things, we're going to go back into response and add a new struct called API error. And for this to be compatible with the Golang error, we have to fulfill the interface of that it having an error method that provides a string when being called. Now, this is the basic fiber error. We're going to extend it a little bit, but it's a good starting point. I also want a nullable field called data, just in case we want to spend more than just a string message. And then not to mix things up with the data part of the API response, I'm going to add a field called API error, or error on the response, so that we could send it to the user. And I do want it to be nullable, so I'm going to make sure that this is a pointer as well. But with this intact, we can go back to error and update this a little bit. So in our JSON here, this is now going to be an API response, so it still converges, or no, what's the word? It's still the same as our regular other responses. We do have an error here because now the error model itself is more than just a string, but I think we'll come back to it. Instead, we're gonna create a constructor to create a new API error. And I believe that's everything that we need. We didn't add any other fields, so that should be correct. No, I think that's correct. I will keep that. And then that just means we need to change this part of the default error handler. So let me just get rid of this so I can start from scratch. So first I'm gonna do a conversion of the raw error into an API error. And then if it's not okay, we also want to check if it's a fiber error. That way we can check if it's a default error from fiber or a custom error from our functionality. I think that's correct so far. Alright, so we no longer need code here. And this error could just respond with E, and this will be e.code. Okay. I believe that's correct. And then lastly, for every possible error, we're just gonna make a simple error function, or simple helper function. No, actually, I do want the error in here. So I'm gonna do error. So then we could add a log here. That way we could log out the raw error, which is the whole point of making this refactor. But going down, we're going to make helper functions so that these things will have less arguments that we could call wherever we need. So far we have a bad request error and an unauthorized error. So these are the API errors that we're going to create. Unauthorized is going to be a little special because we want to provide a string that's secure and safe to the user, or safe to expose to the user. But I believe that's everything we need here. So let's just update our auth controller once again. And we're going to go down the list of all of our errors created and send back the raw error. So this one is bad request, error, bad request, error, unauthorized, registration error. I think that's correct. Now to login. Okay, those are all unauthorized errors. And then finally in me, we'll do a invalid credentials as the unauthorized error here. This also reminds me, in our middleware, we should also change this error handler as well. So now we do response.badRequest or unauthorized. And if we are responding with other status codes, we should make those as we go along. But I believe everything is in place now, where I'm happy with the response structures. So that means this is a good spot to make a commit. So, consolidate, that's the right word. Alright, so this commit's going to be Refactor Responses, and that should be good. So it's actually time to plan out our data models, and I'm using a website called dbdiagram.io, which just makes it a little bit easier. But I went ahead and already made the models that we're going to be using. The main model that we're going to be creating for this application is transactions, and it's going to have all of these different properties. We're going to add the created at and updated at that we've added to all of our models, but I'm also going to go with the title and the amount, which makes sense. Also, currency, because I think it'll be useful for anyone following this tutorial to not just default to USD. Enum for the transaction type, so it could be either an income or an expense, so money coming in or out. And then I've also added a category model. This is more just to show what kind of transaction it was and where it's going. So it could be a grocery expense or a freelance income. So I think that's just useful data to have, and both of which are going to be dependent on the user. So only the current user has access to these data that pertains to them. But with that, let's actually write the SQL for this. And let's add a new file. This is 03 create transactions.sql. And that's the default boilerplate. What else did I add on this? User ID, text, references, user's ID. I believe that's correct syntax. We also need a category, so let's do that. Okay, I think that's correct so far. So that means this is category ID. Alright, what else did I add on this? Title is text, amount is numeric, and then finally we need to create an enum. Create type as enum, so this will be income. Alright, so I believe all of this is the correct syntax. Nothing too crazy in terms of the SQL that we wrote. Something new is probably the enum syntax as well as the numeric. How numerics work is we're giving the amount of bytes that we're going to use before and after the decimal point. So I'm defaulting to 2 places after decimal. I believe most currencies don't have anything more than that, so that should be fine. If not, feel free to edit that and make it a little bit more robust. But because this is all inside the Docker entry point, what we can do is kill your current Docker container image, remove it, and just call docker compose up again, and this should just run all of the subsequent SQL that we've rewritten, which this should be a good indicator that it's working. And then from here, the next step is to add these into our schemas model, which is not there. It's in models/schemas. No. Oh, this actually should be no. Okay, I believe everything here is correct. So it should look something like this. No new concepts here. So I don't think I need to actually say anything. But those are the models. I think this is also a good time to make a small commit. Not a lot of code, but it's a good stopping point before we set out to create the controllers and services for the CRUD part of our application. So I just wanted to define our transaction models or data models and push this. Alright, so from here, I think we're gonna just go through the services and controller of the categories. So let's do the service first. And I always forget to make these a pointer, but so similarly to our user service, we're gonna create a struct and a constructor. And I believe for the category service, it's gonna be basic CRUD. So we'll just have the 5 basic CRUD operations. We're gonna get list all of them, but since these are related to the user ID, we need to get it by the user ID. Get by ID, create, update, and delete are pretty much self-explanatory, but let's go through each one. So get all by user ID, of course, we'll need the user ID. And this query is gonna be a simple select all or simple select star from categories where user ID is the provided argument. And it's also important here that we're using the .select operator. This will give us the list of everything that comes back. So the return here is a slice of categories and an error. And this is still mad because this needs to be a slice. So there, that's fixed. Next we have get by ID. And get by ID is essentially the same thing, except we're only getting one, and the argument is now the ID of that category. And the returns here is one category and the error. Well, I suppose this is actually a pointer because this is nullable, nullable, so I need to do a reference to and then the pointer as the return. Now for create, we just need the user ID and the title, and that's going to both be strings. And just like how we did in the user service, we're going to do a query X to do the insert, providing user ID and title here for the necessary things, add the error checking, which means this is a good time to add the return statement. And then for the rows that we want to return, we need a struct scan, which means first we need to call rows.next and then rows.struct_scan so that we can bind the data into the model that we have for category and then finally return it. And I want to do delete first, just because it's easier. Essentially, it's going to be the same steps. We're still going to be using query X. So most of this is going to be the same, so I'll copy it and paste it down here. The only thing that changes is the query itself. So now it's a delete from category where ID is ID, and return the category as well as the error. Now for update, we still need to find the category that we're updating, so we'll need the ID. But we also need to think about what fields are updatable. And thankfully, our category schema is pretty simple. We only really want to update the title. We haven't really made this or expanded this schema to actually be more useful than that, so it'll just be a title for now. So that means we'll also need the title here, and now we just need to set the query. I actually want the ID to be the first argument, so let's do it this way. And I believe that's everything that we need for our service. Alright, I instantiated all of our services in server main, I believe. So that means it needs to be over here in start. So this is the category service, service dot new category service, and we need the database undefined new category service. Oh, that's why I made a mistake. This is not a method, it's a constructor. Should be a function. There we go. That's better. We don't currently have a controller set up, so I'm going to comment this out for now. And we can go ahead and start the category controller. So this would be category.go, package controller. And I believe all we really need here is the service. So that should be the boilerplate for our category controller. And let's stub out all of our methods. And remember that they're all fiber controllers, so all of them will take in the context and return an error. And I believe all of these, we actually do want them to be authenticated, so I'm just gonna quickly grab these 3 lines here and add it over to the front. You know what, I'm gonna update the auth controller a little bit because I don't want the username to be the subject, I want the ID. So I'm gonna do a small tangent of updating the authorization a bit. So subject is being assigned here and create token. I mean, I don't really need to change that. I just want this to be ID. And that means I have to update the call to create token and pass in the user.id there and there, which now means that this is the incorrect service call. We want to do get by ID of the user ID. So we're gonna update, or we're gonna add a new call in user.go, or the user service, which will just be basically a clone of this function, but instead of get by username, this will be get by ID. And we'll just change all this to ID, and that should fix the entire flow so that our token has the user ID, not their username. That'll make things a little bit easier for authorizing some of these things in the list, or in the CRUD operations that needs authentication. If error.nil, return. This will be a not found, right? So that also means we'll add a new error. Response, error. So this is not a bad request. This is not unauthorized. This is error not found. We can just make this a little easier and not even send a message. I'll just do resource not found. I think that's fine. But this is the error that we're gonna return from here. Error not found, and we do want the raw error, so we'll pass that in. Otherwise, this is a response okay. So for get, it's gonna be a little different. We actually want the ID from the params, which we will be passing in through Fiber when we set up our routes. But other than that, passing the ID, everything else remains the same, with one change, and that is we're gonna check the user ID on the user ID of the token, which means we actually do need these 3 again. So let me just add that here and change this to user ID. And if the user IDs don't match, then we'll just send unauthorized. And with this logic, it means that only the current user can see their own categories. So with create, we do need the user ID, so we'll take that from the token. And we also need the title, and that's going to come from the JSON body. So if we go back to the auth controller, it'll look something like this. The only difference is we're going to make a new input, and it does seem a little overkill since it's only one attribute, but just to preserve the convention that is throughout the rest of our application, let's also add this. And instead of auth model, this is the category inputs. But from here, we could call our services create, passing in the user ID, as well as the input.title. And if something goes wrong, I think this is still considered a bad request, so I'll do this. Otherwise, it's a response.created, and that will conclude our creates. So update. So same thing, we're starting with the user ID and body parsed input. Ooh, actually, we need to make an update to the service. So I just remember that we're going to want to add another constraint to both update and delete. And all I'm going to do is add user ID to both the update and delete functions, and update their SQL queries to include the user ID, both of which is going to be a where and, so it'll have to have both constraints. And this way we'll have extra authorization security so that a user can't accidentally update a category by another user. And this security is in the data layer, so it's more secure than being in the API layer, if that makes sense. So back in the category, in update, we also want the ID param, so I'll just add it right there underneath the user ID. And the order is ID, user ID, and title, so that should be the correct order. I suppose like a database error would be a better one, but I think it still uses the same status code. So I don't even know if like there's really a necessary reason to make a new error response, but And then for delete, I believe we can just add pretty much the same thing. The only thing we're updating here is the method call. So this will be deletes, which doesn't need a title, so we get rid of the body parsing here. And that will complete our controller, which now means we could add it to our server main. So this is controller.new category controller, which takes in CS. And then we need to update setup routes to take in both of these controllers. Where is that? Here. So I guess CC category controller, and then we could actually just make a new group here. Get post put. So that's all the CRUD stuff. Within this route group, we want all of these routes to be authenticated. So every single one is going to need a token just to go through. And in main.go, we can finally just do comma cc, and all of that will now allow us to test these new routes. So let's do that. So docker compose up and air. All right, let's run through all of this. Let's see if we're still logged in and cannot reuse this token. So, oh wait, how about now? Nope, it's expired. So that means we'll need a login. And all right, I didn't see it. Fine, I'll just register. All right, cool. Let's grab this token. Now I'm just gonna make a new request in Insomniac, just so that we have the login ready to go whenever we restart the application. We're at port 4000, and we need to go to categories, which I don't remember how I spelled it. Setup routes. No, it's singular. Okay, fine. Alright, well that's good. It's empty, which, I mean, we did kind of expect. But let's do a create, and we only need a title, so let's just make a utilities category right now, which works. Let's also just make some more random ones. So travel, luxury, I guess, is a good category. So now at get all, we should get all three, which is correct. And let's grab the ID for luxury. So that'll be /this, which gives us that singular one, where we can do an update, which also works. And let's test a delete where we're not logged in. And we get a correct error code, so that's technically correct. But if we are logged in, the delete is successful, so that's good. So all the routes are working that we created for categories. So let's quickly make a commit that we completed the categories. And we've also updated the JWT payload to use the user ID instead of the username. So I think it's kind of important to add that to the commit description as well. But now we can start doing the transactions. So we're going to follow similar steps. So we're going to create a transaction service first. And I do want to start with just the simple CRUD operators. We'll do the full list or select all afterwards. just because it's a little bit more involved and we're going to focus on pagination. So here's get by ID. So for creating an update, I think I'm going to do something a little different, which is inside of inputs, I'm going to create a new input, and this will have all the attributes that we want from the actual schema itself, which in here is going to be this portion right here. So I'm going to paste that in here. We could probably get rid of the db struct literal tag. We don't really need that here. I'm also going to get rid of the user ID. So that means here we're going to need input, which is going to be model.transaction input, as well as the user ID. And then in update, we're going to have the same thing, but I also want the ID of the thing we're updating first. So we'll do ID string first. Actually, let's put the strings first and the input as the last argument. So now in create, we're going to actually build a transaction with the user ID and the model transaction, or the input. Wait, what else do I have in this? Category ID, title, amount, currency, okay. I think that's it, right? I wish Go had a spread operator because Alright, but this time, instead of using query X, since we're basing our query on a struct, we're going to use db.namedQuery. And let me just do this. We're going to pass in prepared as the struct that we're going to be using. Since we have a prepared struct, we're going to be using the colon syntax for each column. And then the rest of the function is going to be exactly what you'd expect from using db.queryX. So we'll return error if there is an error, and then if not, we'll struct scan into a transaction bar, and then return that results. And then for update, we're going to have basically the same functionality with only changing the query itself. So this will be update. Okay, I think that's the correct query. So we have category ID, title, amount, currency, type. The dates are automatic, and then we're setting it with a constraint of ID and user ID. So good so far. Now let's do delete. Alright, so delete is functionally identical to the one that we did for categories. We only need the ID and the user ID, so we don't actually need to do any fancy name query. So that's why we're using query X here. But this completes our transaction as of now. Let's go ahead and create our controller now. Alright, so once again, boilerplate. And I think for all the CRUD operations, we could copy everything from get down of our category and just paste it here. And we'll go down the list, but I think all we need to do is change category controller here to transaction controller, or actually just replacing all the instances of category with transactions, and these should all work correctly. But here's the completed get. Alright, create's a little different. Instead of doing input.title, we actually want to pass in the entire input itself. And then with update, ID, user ID, input, okay, that's the correct order. So that's update. And then delete should be correct. Now we'll do another review of putting all this together in main. So service first, then the controller, which takes in a service, and then with setup routes, we need to pass it in. So and make sure that setup routes also takes in the new controller. So that's adding it here. TC is controller, transaction controller, and then we'll go down the list and deletes. So there's our CRUD routes. And remember, we are saving the root route for last so that we can work on pagination. But with all of this, you can go ahead now and test it out. So I'm doing a little bit of testing, and I just want to go through what I need to fix. So both in schema and inputs, I mistakenly typed amount as a string. So we need to change that to a float. And I'm going to with float 32. I don't think we need that much precision for currency amounts, but you go with float 64 if you really think you need it. So that's transaction in schemas and the transaction input as well. And then currently in my testing, I also remembered that our database schemas all have plural names. So I'm going to also add, or I'm gonna fix that because they're all singular in the code at the moment. So basically adding S's to all the transactions or references to the transaction table. So this should be plural, so transactions, S. And with that saved, this now should post violates foreign key constraint. Transaction category ID foreign. What? Category underscore ID. Oh, ha, I'm an idiot. In JSON, it should be camel case. Rows are closed. That's a new one. Okay, so kind of dumb, but in create, I forgot to add the returning star, and that'll fix that issue. And in update, also dumb, but I forgot to add commas. But now all of our CRUD operations should be working correctly. Now let's start on our pagination. So I think for pagination, let's start in the controller layer and then work our way back to the data layer. So up at top, let's make a new function or method where we're going to call getAll, or we're going to name it getAll. And it's essentially just another fiber handler. And as with get, we're going to need everything from the user JWT. But also from here, we're also going to want the page and page size. And we're going to use the query method on the fiber context. We're going to expect it all to be an int, so we will let fiber do the conversion for us, and we don't have to do it ourselves. Let's use underscores, that would make more sense. So for page, I want to default it to 0, but for page size, let's go with a default of 25. I think that should be fine. But with all of this, we will now know that our service was going to need page, page size, and user ID. So we'll come back to getAll to finish it out, but in the service, let's make a new method. So getAll will return a slice of transaction and an error. And we did say we want the user ID, which is a string, and then page and page size, which are both ints, so I actually don't need this. All right, we could start with the simple select star statement. Let's change it to a template string so that we can also add limit and offset. So limit is the page size, and then the offset is, we can make a new variable for that, and we can put that here. So offset basically is the starting point of our select. So for every subsequent page, we're gonna skip the whatever amount of items we've already seen and just return the rest. I think that's good for now. Let's add it back to our controller. And this is a getAll. We need the user ID, page and page size. I think this is actually a not found error, maybe. If there's an error, it would actually be a database error, but this will be fine for now. But if everything's okay, then we'll do response.ok. We need these contexts and fiber.net. And I think that should do it. All right, let's run a quick test. So login, grab token, transaction, update token, and we're doing get all transactions, so we don't need this. Method not allowed. Oh, right. We need to add this method into our routes, and that is in routes transaction get pc dot get all. All right, let's try that again. Send resource not found. What? Offset must not be negative. Oh, I think we actually want this to default to 1. So the page is 1, page size is 25. Send. There's all of our transactions, which is good. Now let's add some query parameters. Let's just do page 2. That should be empty. And then if we do 1 and page size is, let's go with 3. There's 3, and that's correct. All right, so pagination is working as we need. I thought that would be more complicated. What was my original plan? Okay, so I think I procrastinated enough on doing the front end, so let's actually just finish this up. And alright, so all we need to do now before we start on the front end is to make sure that we have cores enabled. Where's our fiber app? Here we go. So it's server main, and we're just gonna add this here, but we need this import. The middleware for cores, so that inside of our new server where we have it, we could add app.use cores.new. And that should be everything that we need for now on our backend. And we can start on the front end. But before that, let's just kill this and make sure that we commit everything. Okay, so this will be our commit. Okay, I think that's a good description. So we completed our transactions, and that'll be our commit. The description is including all the minor mini steps that we did, but that should be it and good to go. So we can push this, and now we can start on the front end.